Hello, listeners. Welcome to another episode of Cognitive Dissidence. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. Rejoining me on the podcast is fan favorite Sim Tack. We brought Sim back on earlier than our normal cadence with him because you might remember a couple weeks ago we had a whole episode about the Sahel and instability there and what it could mean. And we were right on target there with this coup in Niger and the things that are happening in the Sahel. So I wanted to bring Sim back on to talk about that. We also talk a little bit about Russia-Ukraine at the end. I'm not going to sit on this episode. I thought maybe it would have enough shelf life to go till next week, but that's just not going to happen. So you're just going to get a lot of content from us this week. So I hope you enjoy it all. Don't miss previous episodes that we posted this week. We had the great episode with Matt Pines about UAPs and aliens on Monday. We had Paul Melly on the political situation, specifically in Niger. He offered a lot of great insight. Sim provides us with some more security-related considerations and also a really European view on the future of Africa, colonialism, intervention, and things like that. If you are interested in CI's research or consulting services or in our asset management services, if you want to become a CI client, get access to our investment strategies, etc., jacob@cognitive.investments is how you can reach me. You can also email me with anything else you have in your mind, whatever tickles your fancy. So, cheers. See you out there. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor. Sim, you were very prescient a couple weeks ago with our focus on the Sahel and Africa. So unlike all of our previous episodes together, rather than start with Russia and Ukraine, we're going to start with Africa, and then maybe we'll do a little Russia-Ukraine at the end. How about that? But it's a testament to just how, is crazy the right word, things are in the Sahel? I mean, we had Paul Melly on the podcast earlier this week who talked specifically about the political situation in Niger, which is changing also radically all over which is changing radically sort of day by day here. We're recording Wednesday, August 9th. This podcast will probably go out at the beginning of next week, although I want to see what you have to say to see how spicy it is and what the time life is on the information that we talk about. But where do you want to start? I mean, Sudan's civil war is getting worse. There's Wagner and parts of the Sahel. Niger is sort of its own thing. Nigeria hasn't ruled out military force, even after the Nigerian Congress said that they weren't going to give the president permission. Help us from a security standpoint. What is the center of gravity? Where are you focused right now, and where should our listeners be focused?
Well, I mean, first off, Jacob, thanks for having me back. We're talking about Niger and the Sahel in general last time really kind of set us up to be talking about this now. But I think, center of gravity is a little bit difficult to define because there's a lot of things happening. There's a lot of different scenarios that can develop from this situation. But the most pregnant question on everyone's mind right now, I guess, is the coup gonna stick? Is the junta going to remain in power? And I think the big question that everybody's trying to figure out to define that outcome is, whether or not we would see any kind of military intervention that could overthrow that leadership. And I think there's probably a couple follow-on questions to that as well. With even if we were to see a military intervention, what would that look like, and what could that cause to go wrong in the region?
Well, that's a great question. So, I was talking with Paul earlier on the podcast, and he gave us a lot of great insights about the politics of Niger and things like that. But the one question that I felt like he danced around a little bit was, I was like, okay, well, Paul, if there is a military intervention, like, by who? Like, who has the guns here? Is this the Nigerian military? I don't think ECOWAS has a military. Is this the French are going to try to string something together? Is this Libya 2.0? It's very... One of the reasons it seems to me like a political accommodation is more likely, and there have been, some little signs. I think the EU said this morning, there's some room for mediation here. Nuland did get into the country. Blinken said that he talked to Bazoum, I think, in the last day or something like that. So you got these little signs that maybe things are going well, but on the flip side, also all of these tensions rising as well. So the question there is, if there is an intervention in Niger to unseat the junta, who's going in with the guns?
Well, there's a couple different ways to think about that, right? First off, let's talk about the people that have been talking about intervention, which is ECOWAS, which of course includes Nigeria as the most populous country within ECOWAS, within the entire region, obviously. So Nigeria would have to be a big component of such a military intervention, I think, both in terms of capacity it brings, as well as in terms of its proximity to Niger. The fact that Nigeria shares a long border with Niger means that they actually have means to get there, which is something that we should not underestimate in this whole talk of a intervention. This is at the scale of the African countries that are talking about intervention. This is a immense logistical undertaking if they were to go ahead with it. So ECOWAS has a history of conducting interventions in the past in the sense of peacekeeping operations, taking part in peacekeeping operations. And then most recently in 2017, they conducted a very small intervention in Gambia. So Gambia was having a constitutional crisis, etc. Senegal, as one of the leading forces, Senegal geographically kind of encapsulates Gambia. So for Senegal, it was kind of like just walking over into the next neighborhood, showing some military force, and the crisis eventually became resolved. Right? Not a major military feat. So when they are talking now about an intervention in Niger, we're talking about something entirely different, something that in recent history ECOWAS has not done. I would dare to say something that none of the countries that would possibly be part of it have demonstrated they would be capable of doing. Even for Nigeria, even though they border on Niger, we've seen over the past 2 decades how much trouble they have had fighting Boko Haram in northern Nigeria. That has taken a toll on the Nigerian military, hasn't always been super successful. And now we're talking about mounting an offensive at an even further distance outside of Nigeria's borders, which you would imagine adds some of that logistical burden, against a force that I would still consider is better organized than Boko Haram at this point.
You were being very diplomatic when you said that the Nigerian military has not had much success against Boko Haram.
Well, not really. I mean, I get where you're playing at, that Boko Haram is still there, but there has been an era of more success than before in the struggle against Boko Haram. So in the final years of Goodluck Jonathan's rule in Nigeria, especially bringing in some of the mercenary forces, South African mercenaries, not Wagner in this case, but he brought in some mercenaries. They changed some ways about how they were fighting, and Boko Haram did take some punches. The area of operations got limited. We're no longer seeing them as active in the main population centers like Maiduguri and places like that. So it's there has been success against Boko Haram, but obviously the crisis is not resolved, right? So yeah, it's a little bit, on the one hand, it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek. The success is not complete, but there has been, improvement at certain periods of time.
Well, let me again then just sort of summarize what you're saying less diplomatically, because I'm thinking about this from the Kooster's point of view. When I ask you who's going to go in with guns to follow through on these threats of a military intervention, it's basically no one. You're basically calling bullshit on it. There is no ECOWAS force. There is no regional force that is capable of going up against Niger's military, which I guess also sort of implied there is that you don't think France is going to do anything. You don't think the United States is going to do anything. Is that correct? It's basically the folks who have taken over the Niger's government can say, okay, you can threaten force all you want. What are you going to do? Who's coming for us? Probably none of you are coming for us. Is that the answer to the question?
So when we're talking about those African actors, yes, for sure. However, you raise France and the US, and I think primarily France is probably one that we should be looking at here in terms of potential military adventurism in this particular region of the world. Wouldn't be their first rodeo, but they so far haven't indicated that this is something that they are planning to do. Electorally, it doesn't sit quite comfortably in France. Macron's typical electoral audience is not very gung-ho about these kind of security, foreign affairs issues. And in fact, I would think that a lot of his typical electorate is kind of opposed to those kind of actions as well. And we've seen Macron, over his presidency, reduce presence in Africa, wind down operations. I mean, obviously some of that under the pressure of events that have been taking place in the region, but still, on a general, to use the popularized American term, in a general retrograde of France's presence in the Sahel. So, I think it's questionable whether France would really consider conducting an intervention, but I think if they would, that changes everything, right? If France were to say, we want to depose this junta, I think that is well within their capabilities, especially if they manage to get some support from ECOWAS, some burden sharing, and that's all fine. But of course, that also puts France in a very difficult position. Now you've essentially just removed part of the Nigerian military, and now you have to work with what remains to try and rebuild all of those security initiatives that you had built before. So it's, even in that regard, it would be a loss. France would end up in a worse position than it was before the coup happened, right? So they can't salvage all of it.
Which sounds like no military intervention to me. I mean, it sounds like there's nobody on the board who is going to be willing to... I mean, the risk reward isn't there either, because whatever you think about, the people who have taken over in Niger, I'm having trouble pronouncing the word junta, so I'm going to try and avoid it for the listeners. If you see me stumbling around my words, that's why. I don't know why I'm having trouble with it this morning. But I mean, if there's nobody to intervene, I mean, isn't it just, and the only thing you get from intervening is probably wrecking the security situation anyway. And we saw this play out in Libya, where Libya just devolved into warring factions and a place for weapon smuggling and jihadists and everything else. So like, do you really want to do that in Niger too, on the actual border now of some of these major countries in Western Africa? It doesn't look like there's anybody there to follow through on the threat.
Yeah, and I think in general, I agree with that. That's the way things are looking now. We'll have to see how that plays out. I don't want to completely close the door to the potential that there would be an intervention. Tomorrow, actually, on Thursday, August 10th, I believe, the ECOWAS leadership is actually going to be having a summit to decide what they're going to do in terms of this intervention or not. They had a ultimatum that ran out past Sunday. So, we're past that. The intervention has not happened yet. That doesn't mean it won't happen. But if it does, then I've got some serious questions about what that actually causes in the region, because that capacity or the capability of Nigeria and other countries to quickly overcome the junta and their military, that's going to be so limited that there's a real potential here of actually starting a protracted conflict, where we could see several years of fighting between those opposing forces. And then I'm imagining countries like Mali and Burkina Faso actually, coming through on some of their statements and coming to the support of Niger, massively complicating the situation. But then you're actually talking about the prospect of a regional war that could last for years at a time when no one is actually keeping all of the jihadist groups in check. This could be a massive gift to all of those violent extreme actors in the region.
Well, this is something I wanted to ask you as well, because Paul on the podcast, in some ways the most shocking thing he said was that 70% of Mali is not under the control of the government. It's under control of jihadists themselves. And just this morning, I put on our CI Knowledge platform a report about a military convoy from Mali that was headed towards Niger getting attacked by an Islamist group. So like if jihadists are going after military convoys that are on their way to Niger to ostensibly show support for that military regime, I mean, that's a hard target. That's not just, blowing up a mosque or doing some kind of terrorist act. That looks like a much more organized force. So, I mean, and you mentioned the prospects of a regional war. In some sense, it's already been a regional war for years, hasn't it? I mean, the level of jihadist activity, I mean, the Sahel has always been a place of lawlessness and things like that. But part of the reason we're getting these coups is because the security situation has degraded so much. So in some ways, it's just recognizing a war that's already happening, right?
True. And I think the main thing is there that the different sides to this conflict are dramatically changing, right? If we go back 10 years, 2013, right after the French intervention in Mali, we have a regional conflict or war going on. But at that time, it is the local governments with foreign support, and of course the French government and the UN forces, etc., that are fighting against these non-state actors, trying to bring back some semblance of stability to the region. But now, with everything that's happened in Mali, Burkina Faso, now Niger, in that decade, we're talking about a potential situation where it's not just the local governments and their Western supporters against the non-state actors. We're talking about a conflict where on the one hand, we'll have those non-state actors, then we'll have some pro-Western or Western-affiliated countries in the definition of the current ECOWAS forces, Chad, which is not in ECOWAS, but of course has a very close relationship, security cooperation with France. You'll have that group of countries that are facing off against that non-state threat, as well as against the threat of this new bloc of military authoritarian regimes that are starting to or possibly will be receiving support from Russia. And, then it all starts to fall apart, right? The dynamics of the conflict, even if we could still define it as the same conflict that was happening before, the dynamics of it have dramatically changed.
Well, and how do you think about, because I think most of the focus here has been on Niger, Western Africa, Nigeria population centers, but I mean, I believe Chad had a coup attempt of its own as well. Libya is not exactly particularly stable, and Sudan, I mean, is in the middle of a civil war. I think the UN said 4 million people have been displaced so far, and I know that's not, we're outside of Francophone Africa and it's a long ways away, but it's still part of the Sahel. So how do you start working in, like, are those things completely separate, or is this just sort of one chain of instability, and what's happening in Sudan is also going to come in and affect some of the things happening in West Africa?
I mean, they're definitely not separate. All of this is very connected in different ways. First, to talk about Chad, actually, because I think Chad has a little bit of an underestimated position in this whole deal, and especially now with, France possibly having to give up its security cooperation in Niger. It might become the sole bastion of actual anti-jihadist operations in the Sahel region. But Chad has somewhat of a level of internal stability. So you mentioned there a potential coup. There wasn't really a coup as much as there have been a rebel attempt to invade the country from outside the country's border. So there's rebel factions that have found a home in Libya, came back into Chad, and were promptly received by French airstrikes. France is a little less risk averse when it comes to protecting Chad. That's kind of always been the case. And talking in the modern times, the past 2 decades. Chad has always been a little easier for France to invade into, which probably has something to do with the fact that a lot of Chad is very remote, rural areas that don't really impact a lot of people when they do something, right? But then what we also had is during that rebel advance, or continued fighting with those rebels after the incident I was talking about, the previous president, Idriss Déby, got killed in fighting. Or at least the official story is he died from wounds that he received on the front line. And then his son essentially took over. His son, who was already being prepared. So, not really a regime change or anything in Chad. France continues to work with the son of Déby, even though, we could raise some questions about the democratic values of the country. But, Chad, that's what Chad is. And I think there's not really a risk of Chad falling in the same way that Niger has, that Mali has, or that Sudan has become involved in its own domestic conflict. But of course, Chad on its own is just one lily pad that you have to deploy forces from. It's not it's not a massive solution to this region-wide problem. And that problem, that's what kind of brings us to all of these other countries. Libya, which you mentioned, is not really solved yet. There is a little less of a focus on the conflict in Libya because the main conflict dynamics have been stabilized. So the fighting between eastern and western parts of Libya, the different competing governments within Libya, that has all been relatively stable under the latest peace agreement. People are very excited about getting oil out and keeping oil running. But in the south of Libya, in the Sahara Desert, which borders Niger, which borders Chad, you still have, local militias roaming around in the midst of criminal organizations that are engaged in illegal mining, human trafficking, and also in extremist organizations that have ties with jihadist groups, etc., or some of those rebel groups that then, try to fight their way into Chad. So, there's a lot of stuff that's going on in Libya that has an impact in Niger, in other regions that there's no real direct solution for. When it comes to Sudan, I think that's a little more of a standalone issue. Sudan is kind of its own cultural entity in this whole as well, right? It sits in the Sahel, but I wouldn't count it as part of the Sahel countries necessarily. The historical and geographic origin of what makes Sudan is really the Nile River, right? I think it sits closer to what Egypt is than what Mali is, if that makes sense. Obviously, there's different ways that we can, divide these countries ethnically, linguistically, and all those kind of things. But Sudan kind of has its own dynamic. But I think the way that they are intertwined with what's happening in Niger and countries like Mali, etc., is especially in the way that they're setting an example. I think that the military factions in Sudan have provided a roadmap for a lot of ambitious military leaders in Africa, where it became very clear in Sudan how you can get away with a coup, how you can provide the semblance of having a civilian transition process while still having your military leadership quite openly in control of the entire process. What guarantees you have to be able to remove those civilians when they actually get a little too uppity, right? So, at the end of the day, I think everybody in Mali, Niger, they noticed what happened in Sudan, and that's why they know that they can do what they did. So they just recently appointed, I forgot what it was, yesterday or the day before, but they appointed a new prime minister in Niger, a former civilian politician that they are bringing back into government. I think there's nobody that assumes that this person is going to have any kind of real power, right? The military is standing behind him, watching his every move, and as soon as he steps out of line, he will be removed as well. And that's something that we've seen happening exactly the same way in Sudan. But it is something that gives Niger an out. They can show, we have a civilian government, we are working on a transition process, so, the West can get off our back and let us do our thing. So they are opening these doors to having some kind of acceptable mediated resolution that brings back development aid and all those kind of things without really forcing the West to conduct any kind of intervention either.
Really sobering to think of Sudan as a role model here, considering, yes, they did what you said, and now they're in a civil war with tens of thousands of people dead and millions displaced. If that's the path that we're on, pretty depressing. But zoom out for a bit here, Sim, and we can take this in the Russia-Wagner direction if you want. But does this matter for the world? I mean, is this just the Sahel is stewing in its own juices to steal from the Churchill line? Or, I mean, is this going to have impact outside of the Sahel?
Look, it matters. I think it matters a great deal. And I think that's why I wouldn't be so certain yet that there's not going to be a military intervention. Because I'm certain that there are other people that are reading the situation in the same way and that are seeing the same kind of risk over the long term, where I think the conclusion will be there is a short pain that we might be able to push through right now to avoid longer term issues. And so the Russia-Wagner story is part of that, but I think the much more important one here has to do with the jihadist groups. So, we have JNIM, which are kind of the collection of the Al-Qaeda affiliates operating in Mali and Burkina Faso and pushing into Niger. We've got the Islamic State affiliates, etc. So those initially came out of the Libya intervention, 2011. They came out with an increased capability. They kind of piggybacked on the Tuareg rebellion inside Mali. They were able to expand. That caused a sense of emergency in Europe, which led France to intervene. Initially, Germany was on board to be part of that intervention. The timeline shifted a little bit, but I mean, if you've got Germany talking about military intervention, stuff's serious, right? I mean, these days. But essentially since then, I would say that whole non-state actor threat has been pushed back a little bit until the past few years, when we've seen especially the dramatic changes in Mali with France being kicked out, so French forces leaving Mali, now the UN mandate ending, so the UN leaving. But if we are now expanding that to Niger, kicking the French out, not having that cooperation again, and then the potential, and I think we alluded to it or spoke about it in the last podcast, but that potential of the jihadist territories in northern Nigeria physically connecting with the ones in Mali, in the northern Sahel, creating one big power vacuum where all of these jihadist groups can roam free. That creates a situation that I think 10 years from now could seriously damage Western interest in a couple different ways. I think at the first stage, we're talking about, local forces not being able to control any of this violence. So this region, as well as adjacent regions, everything along the West African coastline essentially, become very dangerous areas for Western tourists or Western business people to visit. We've seen already in the recent past terrorist attacks from these groups all the way on the Ivory Coast coastline, right? So these groups have a transregional / transnational terrorism agenda. When they are able to assemble the capacity to do that, they will actually conduct those attacks. And on a second level, not just against Westerners traveling, but if you remember the attacks in southern Algeria against gas infrastructure just before everything kicked off in Mali and everything, those kind of attacks could come back as well. So attacks on oil infrastructure, gas infrastructure, mining operations in the entire region. This could really harm, Western business interests across the entire region, but of course also local economic development. If you can't have any kind of stable economic relationship with the countries that are willing to invest in natural resource extraction, you're not going to be bringing in any revenue in those countries either, and that situation is going to perpetuate, get worse. And then I think at a final level, of course, when we're talking about, considering this as the potential new source of a next Islamic State caliphate, something similar to what existed in Syria and Iraq around 2014, if we remember how that inspired all of those attacks in Europe, in the United States, that is something that could very well come back from this as well. So yeah, in that regard, I think the West should really care about what could potentially develop there. We could slip back into a very messy situation that we faced 10 years ago, and that we could face again. And in that context, maybe conducting some kind of an intervention to rectify power in Niger is kind of a small cost to avoid that longer term pain. But it's difficult to see that, and I think it's especially difficult for policymakers to operate on a timeline longer than their electoral terms, right?
Well, and I know that there are resources in this part of the world, but it's not like there aren't resources other places. I mean, I know France, for example, has interests in uranium in Niger, but there are alternatives. Maybe you have to invest in them and build them out, but it doesn't seem to me like this part of the world has resources that you can't replicate elsewhere. But maybe this is a time to bring in what the heck Russia and even China are thinking about here, because based on what you just described, that vision, it doesn't sound to me like Russia wants that any more than the West does. That's not just a Western interest. It's not like the Russians like it when jihadists are running around. They've got their own issues in terms of the Muslim share of their population, their interests in the Middle East, a whole bunch of other things. And one of the reasons I got invited to Russia a couple times before the war was because I wrote a piece that said, hey, the United States doesn't like jihadists. Russia doesn't like jihadists. Maybe there is some room for cooperation between the United States and Russia on the Middle East in getting rid of jihadists. That never really came to fruition, or at least it never got more than grassroots level. But in the context of the rise of ISIS, and when things were really getting serious against ISIS, there were small things that happened in the Middle East where Russia and the United States, they talked and they did deconfliction, and they made sure that they worked together to make sure that some of these, particularly disgusting versions of Islamist jihadists couldn't gain control and couldn't, assert their writ over these large places. So the question that I'm building up towards is, it doesn't seem to me like anything that is happening is in Russia's interests. Like, it's not in Russia's interests for Prigozhin or Wagner to be, ruling over fiefdoms in Niger like it's Heart of Darkness, and having ISIS like right next door and the Al-Qaeda franchise next door to that. Is that really in Russia's interest? I would think that Russia's looking at this thinking, this doesn't look so good. And one of the things that sort of gives me some hope that read is right, that Algeria has been very critical of the coup in Niger and is having none of it. And Algeria has sort of aligned itself more with Russia and China in general. So maybe talk to me about Russia's interests here. Like, am I anywhere close to reality, or is that just wishful thinking?
Well, I mean, my analysis of Russian interests would be very similar to that, but I think we also need to be understanding that Russia's perception of its interests might be different from that analysis. And I mean, we know that in Africa, Russia's been operating on a very, very oversimplified concept of realpolitik and how it's been trying to expand influence in the African continent. They are thinking about Africa in really old school colonial terms, based on concepts of, if we can push out the Western influence and establish our own influence, that's a victory. To what end? Nobody knows, but it's a victory, right? So that kind of thinking is not very productive in dealing with these kind of crises. And I think that given, the intense escalation between East and West over the course of the conflict in Ukraine, that Russia also sees some additional wins in their behavior in Africa by simply causing things that the West does not want. And in that, I mean, maybe I'm wrong there. maybe I should hope I'm wrong, but I think that at this point, Russia believes that the more it can mess up for Western security initiatives and Western development initiatives in Africa, the more pressure it is putting on the West, and the more it is forcing the West to bow to Russia eventually.
Demented. What about China? Because China also, China has interests in economic development in sub-Saharan Africa. The whole threat of China has been, hey, China's building the roads and building the infrastructure, and they're getting access to the resources. I would think that China also has no interest in seeing this level of instability in Africa. They have investments of their own in countries like Niger trying to build infrastructure there. If China wants to behave like a great power, here's an opportunity, China. But, it also, as you said, this entire thing also trapes on tropes. That's quite a sentence I just came up with there. Trapes on tropes of colonialism in general. And I don't think it's just Russia here. I wrote this a couple of years ago, actually right before the pandemic. I put out a report on this and talked about how one of my predictions for the 2020s was a renewed scramble for Africa and neocolonialism 2.0. And maybe we won't call it colonialism because that's politically incorrect. But that sure is what it looks like. If sub-Saharan African countries aren't going to stand up and represent themselves and represent their own interests, you've got great powers circling the continent, trying to get access to resources, trying to get new export markets, trying to get access to cheap labor and things like that. You start to put it all together, like that looks an awful lot like colonialism. I rambled a little bit there, but where does China fit into this?
So before I answer on China, I will talk about China, but first, I think that's a really interesting thought that you're positing there on that return of colonialism and, under a different name, etc. I think there's one really important question there. Even if you want to do the best things that you want to do for Africa from the perspective of the West, if you want to help Africa establish stability, and I'm talking about Africa in a very general sense here, but if you want to help Mali, if you want to help Niger, and obviously we can't just tackle Africa as one single unit. There's a lot of different situations, a lot of different dynamics going on in different places. But if you want to help these countries establish stability, find some kind of maturity in governance, and economically develop themselves, improve their infrastructure, etc., all the things that you would have to do in order to achieve that, how different do they look from colonialism? Right? And it's a tough question because you can argue from the perspective of a Westerner, I want the best for Africa. We want to improve their security. It helps us with our security as well. It's a win-win situation. Rarely do countries do something out of pure altruism. But I think a lot of the things that we are also painting as neocolonialism can also be done with the best intentions, right? I don't think it's necessarily a motive of exploitation that is below all of these things, but that is the connotation that those terms carry, right?
I'll hear you, and I'll jump in though, which is to say, colonialism 1.0 wasn't a bunch of evil people with mustaches looking at Africa and being like, we will conquer this territory for ourselves. They also had an ideology of, we are helping these people. This is the white man's burden. We must bring these people into modernity.
I feel like you've missed part of Belgian history there.
Well, the Belgians were particularly noxious from that point of view, but even the Belgians...
you just perfectly summarized Leopold II's approach to Congo, but yeah. No, but I get your point. I get your point, yeah.
The ideology was not that we're going to do evil things to Africa. It's no, we're helping Africa, and yes, we're taking all these things. And it's like what you're talking, maybe I'm being a little too cynical, but yes, of course we're helping Africa, and we want to extract all these resources and do all these other things that are for us. That was the whole thing. It's not like anybody started a war saying they were the evil ones, and it's not like anybody colonized a country thinking they were doing something evil. They thought they were doing something right, at least in their framework of what morality was, however demented it looks to us today.
No, that's fair. That's fair. And those perceptions and the content of those actions change over time, of course. I guess the main point that I want to make is this is when we are talking about the Western role in Africa, and comparing that to the Russian role or the Chinese role in Africa, I think it's important to make that kind of to kind of distinguish between the motives that are behind it, the motives and the methods, because I don't think this is the same kind of situation that we saw in the 1800s when it was great powers competing to have chunks of Africa under their control to be able to exploit in one way or the other, regardless of how they explain that at home. I think that's a way of thinking that's today really not present in Western thinking when they are planning these kind of operations. When France is thinking about whether or not to intervene in Niger, I think they're not really thinking in those terms as much as they are thinking about, how can we salvage our regional stability operations? How can we avoid those future security problems, etc.? So I just think that it's important to separate that from what I consider to be the Russian thinking, which is more about, hey, like which countries can we color in on the map and drop some Wagner dudes and then say that they're part of the Russian Empire. But anyway, to get to your question on China, sorry, I didn't mean to get into a whole semantic discussion.
No. This is very, very important. And I'm curious what you're going to say about China, because the flip side here is that from China's perspective, Russia is a colonial European power, and China hates colonialism. China had a front row seat in some ways, China has much more in common with African nations than Russia or Europe or anybody else does, because they were on the receiving end of European colonialism as well. So I'm curious if you think part of their unwillingness to wade in here is that because maybe the real anti-colonialist answer to my question is, we don't have an interest. Leave them alone. Let them deal with their own things. But anyway, answer the China question. I'm curious where you're going to take it.
Yeah, I think China definitely has an interest, but I think that China is very different from all the other countries in the world, and that might be that difference between having that colonial, the colonizer history versus the colonized history, right? But China, in its Africa policy, and I think in most parts of the world, have taken a very soft power approach, right? I mean, we've talked a lot in the West about soft power, and we try to embody that, but at the end of the day, it turns out all of our biggest decisions come down to the use of hard power. But when it comes to China, they have always shied and continue to shy from any kind of direct military intervention, or even really forcing regime change in countries in Africa. So I think that makes China very flexible in dealing with these kind of crises as well. So in Niger, yes, they have their economic interests in mining, in infrastructure development, etc. But whether it's Bazoum running the country or the military leadership taking over, I think that China is also very aware that they can work with whoever runs Niger. They might have to...
Even ISIS?
Well, that's a difficult question. That one might be a little unconsolable with some of their domestic concerns. But probably not ISIS. But I think it's especially authoritarian military regimes, I think they don't have a problem with that. They might even see some benefits to the long-term relationship they can build there, as opposed to civil governments that might change every now and then. But none of these regimes in Africa, whether democratic or non-democratic, have any problems working with China either. China brings in bags of money. China brings in infrastructure, and we can question the whole setup that they do, how sustainable that whole approach is, both for China and for the African countries. But the fact is that at first glance, this is a positive and useful cooperation. So I think China just doesn't risk losing anything in these kind of crises. So they are not in a position where they would have to consider conducting any kind of intervention or supporting it. I don't think they're in a position where they would have to condemn anything that's happening either, because I think they just know that they will be there before and after, regardless of what happens.
Well, and to make your point even sharper, neither China nor Russia have the straitjacket of shared values to deal with.
Yeah.
So when Blinken is even out there talking about Niger, or Victoria Nuland is in Niger, they're talking about shared values and democratic values and things like that, which, this is where I lose a little bit of my objectivity, and Western hypocrisy bothers me a little bit, because A, what shared values, and B, let's just take the United States for example. The United States has close relations with Saudi Arabia and has for decades. The United States has done an about face on El Salvador recently. It has all sorts of nefarious connections with military authoritarian regimes when it has suited it to do so. But you get into these weaker countries, and suddenly we're talking about shared values, and shared values is in the first paragraph of what's going on in Niger. Like, there's just something there that doesn't quite line up. If you're pursuing values-based foreign policy in Africa, the actors that are not pursuing values-based policies, they will be the victors in the long run.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly the dynamic that we've seen play out in Mali, Burkina, Niger, where, on the one hand, the militaries in those countries have grown tired of not achieving success in a physical military sense. But on the other hand, they also feel from their own perspective that they have been massively restrained, because they are not able to deploy the very crude and inhumanitarian methods that they would normally be deploying in a situation like that. So they feel like they are being handcuffed while their leadership is talking about democracy and human rights. And I think it's that kind of disconnect that effectively causes these military leaders to launch their coups, and finds them in bed with Russia, with Wagner, who obviously have no qualms about approaching things in the very same way.
Yeah, and I mean, you probably saw this, that Bazoum was able to, he wrote an op-ed that appeared in the Washington Post, and it's an interesting article, and we posted it in the last podcast we did, but the last a couple sentences are, I call on the U.S. government and the entire international community to help us restore our constitutional order. I mean, like, the United States is not going to do that. Nobody is coming to rescue Niger's constitutional order. Like, if Niger is going to rescue its constitutional order, it's going to have to come from Niger themselves. And I don't know, that just underscores your point. It's going to be very difficult.
But the question is, though, should we? And, this is, I think there, in a lot of ways, the way that the world has to make a choice about how they react to the situation in Niger is very similar to the way that the world has made a choice to react to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and connecting to the same choices that we made in the past when Russia went to war in Georgia, when Russia first came into Ukraine in 2014. The center of all of these questions is the concept of a rules-based society, a rules-based international society, right? We have our UN charters, we have our different treaties that everyone is party to, but that rules-based society, going back to concepts of Westphalia, which defined the nation state and all those kind of things, they are also tied to that concept of constitutional legitimacy within countries. So, can you have a international rule-based society if you allow those rules to be trampled at a domestic level, right? And that's I know that gets into like political philosophy rather than the pragmatics of geopolitics that we're normally talking about here. But at the end of the day, if you're choosing not to protect that constitutional legitimacy in Niger, you are opening up the door. And I mean, this choice came much earlier in Mali, where countries decided not to protect that constitutional legitimacy. And we see, there's kind of a domino effect happening now where other countries are falling to the same challenges. But if you don't draw the line anywhere, if you don't at some point start to say, this is the level at which we need to defend those rules so that we can actually sustain a livable international society, the problem is just going to keep getting worse. And we saw the same with Russia, where the first decade of Russia's resurgence, everybody was kind of like, let's stay out of the way of this and let's try to negotiate our way around it until, they launched a massive invasion into Ukraine, and finally the West started to say, like, okay, we actually do need to go and support, not directly take part, not directly intervene, but at the very least support Ukraine in maintaining some of this rules-based environment.
As we say back on the farm, I think the horse has already bolted from the barn, Sim. I think the red line has already been crossed, and I doubt, like the cynic in me doubts that anybody will lift a finger here to probably help Niger in any meaningful way. And that's a good segue, because I think Ukraine is the perfect example. And just look at the difference between what Russia did in Ukraine in 2014 versus 2022. The difference there was not the international community or anything else like that. It was Ukraine itself. If you go back to the weeks before the invasion, the United States was pulling out all of its essential staff. It was basically saying, we're not going to do anything to save you, Ukraine. You're talking about the Germans now and their military industrial complex is humming. I've referenced this before on the podcast. A couple weeks before the invasion, they sent 10,000 helmets to the Ukrainians. That was their contribution to Ukraine's defense in the initial stages. The reason Ukraine has become different is because in 2022, as opposed to 2014, the Ukrainians fought back. And Zelensky showed that no, there actually is a force here, a regime here, a people here that want to defend this. And there is somebody who, if you give us the weapons, we will do the task. And we have sort of some sort of allegiance to constitutional order and rules-based order. And we'd like to be part of the EU and NATO, and we will clean up corruption. We'll do all these other things. The representative voice of that in Niger is imprisoned in his own house. It's the sort of thing where unless you get some kind of actor that is going to rise in Niger, and there was some reporting today that there was a counter coup force saying, hey, we want Bazoum back. Like, if Niger itself will stand up, I'm sure they will find Western supporters for what they're going to do. But I think it's beyond, first of all, I think it's beyond Western capabilities to do what you're talking about. But I also just don't think the West fundamentally is going to intervene in the way that you're talking about. If it wouldn't even intervene for Ukraine, like, it's not going to intervene for Niger unless I really don't have my finger on the pulse.
Well, one of the big reasons that we don't see direct intervention in Ukraine is, of course, the potential of escalation with Russia directly, both at a conventional level and, of course, a nuclear level. Niger does not carry that risk, right? So I would argue there's much more of an opportunity to draw that red line in a place like Niger than there is in Ukraine or with Russia. But yeah, I mean, I agree on the whole with what you're saying about Ukraine providing a local actor that the West can actually stand behind and work with. If there is no such thing in Niger, that doesn't exist. But there is such a thing in Niger, though. Like, there are politicians that were removed from power that would be the legitimate heirs to the throne if a intervention were to remove the junta, right? So it's not like there's a complete vacuum there.
If the guys with guns are cool with the politicians being in jail, then like it's over. Like, Niger's military seems to have closed ranks, and it's August 9th. Maybe factions in Niger's military will come out against it, but thus far, it seems like the men with guns are okay with what's happening. They have not put up much of a fight.
Yeah, but I mean, and this gets really into the weeds. But of course, there's also always the effect of nobody wanting to move first, right? And it's only when the outcome becomes obvious that everybody picks their true side, right? And that's why the entire Nigerian military did not stand up simultaneously and conduct this coup. A couple guys did, and everybody noticed, oh, it's going to swing this way, so we'll all join their side. So I wouldn't say that there's any sign that there would be no platform to have a counter-coup movement. But, I mean, granted, it is not without risk. It is not simple. It's especially not simple to sell that story electorally at home in the US, in Europe. And on top of that, you're kind of inadvertently also feeding into the narrative that has been used in the Sahel region to push French influence back about France being this oppressive colonial power intervening to restore a president that's been deposed obviously doesn't really negate that narrative too effectively.
Yeah. Speaking of outcomes that are completely unclear, before I let you go, what do you think about Ukraine and Russia right now? We've got drones in Moscow. We've got Russia. I was surprised at how precise they've been in hitting some of this grain infrastructure, whether in these towns of Ismail and Reni on the Danube across from Romania, whether it's Odessa. Ukraine's counteroffensive doesn't seem to be making a lot of headway. Where is your headspace now with the Russia-Ukraine war?
Yeah, I mean, I think it hasn't really evolved much since last we spoke when it comes to the main ground movements in the offensive. I still think, and based on things I'm seeing, that there are very significant results especially in terms of attrition that is being forced on Russian forces near a front line. The balance in firepower between the two sides. I guess the main thing is that, as Russia gets weaker on that front line, of course, the Ukrainian forces that are pushing also grow tired, right? So the question is, once that opportunity for breakthrough really presents itself, where is that difference between those two going to lie? And I'm still hopeful that we will be able to see those kind of breakthroughs before winter and actually see some significant recovery of terrain, which will keep Ukraine in the fight. At the same time, when we look away from the actual front lines and the ground war, I guess, I think it's been very notable how Russia has been unable to fend off all the attacks against their navy, right? We've seen some very major incidents in the past 2 weeks with a couple of Bukov corvettes being targeted, a Ropuka vessel being nearly sunk, and an oil tanker that was serving Russian military operations also being hit. So, there's been some very notable results there in restraining Russia's freedom of movement in the Black Sea, which is always something from the beginning of the conflict, since before the conflict, it's the one part that everybody always assumed would be uncontested, right? Russia's ability to operate in the Black Sea, because Ukraine doesn't have a navy, etc. And I think Ukraine has really, really proved everybody wrong, including myself. Didn't see that coming at all, but they are almost completely containing the Russian navy to its ports, and that's massive in terms of result. And then when you combine that with some of the long distance strikes that that Ukraine has been conducting against the bridges in northern Crimea, so the bridges connecting Crimea to the Ukrainian mainland, as well as some of the attacks against the Kerch Bridge. There's a lot of focus on disrupting those logistics that run through Crimea, which, depending on how the war goes on the ground, could put Russia in a really difficult position still to sustain their control over Crimea in the long term. But we'll have to see those advances and the breakthroughs actually happen at the front line. Okay.
Well, Sim, I know you're super busy with everything that's going on. Thank you for making the time, and we'll have you back. We'll have you back in a couple months to talk about whether those breakthroughs happened or not, if you're down for it.
Yes, definitely. Thank you.
All right. Cheers. Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidents podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur.